Hello, Math 2 students. The purpose of this video is to provide you with a resource that explains everything you need to know about factoring quadratic equations and solving quadratic equations by factoring. The first thing that you need to know is that you need to write the polynomials in standard form. So if your polynomial has an A term, a B term, and a C term, you have to write it in standard form. If your polynomial has an A term and a B term, you have to write it in standard form. The only time that you should not write your polynomial in standard form is when it has an A term with an x squared and a constant. In that case, you want to solve for x and use a square root to find the solution. Now, how do you know what signs to use on your binomials? It depends on, first of all, what your value of C is. So the first indication, if you look at your C value and it's negative, you know your signs are going to be different. That can make the problem more difficult because sometimes you start out with plus then minus, and in order to factor correctly, you need to change it to minus and then plus. If your C value is positive, now you need to check the sign of your B value. So if your C is positive and your B is positive, both signs will be positive. If your C is positive and your B is negative, both signs will be negative. Now, when you look at a polynomial that needs to be factored, there are three things that can be true about your A value. The first one is that your A value can be 1. If you have a trinomial and your A value is 1, finding the correct factored form is as simple as this. Find numbers that multiply to your C term, but add or subtract to your B term. If your A is -1, or if your A is not 1, the first thing that you're going to need to do is try to take out the greatest common factor. So you want to find the greatest number that divides evenly into each term of your polynomial. That will be the greatest common factor. Then you have to find the remaining polynomial that's left after you take out the greatest common factor. The easiest way to identify that polynomial is to divide each of its terms by the greatest common factor. And whatever you get when you divide, that is going to be the term that remains inside the parentheses. Now, when you're trying to find the binomial factors, again, there's three things that can happen. The first one, and the easiest one to identify, is if you have a difference of two squares. The next thing that can happen is it might be a perfect square trinomial. And then finally, if you don't have the difference of two squares and you don't have a perfect square trinomial, you're just going to have to guess and then check your binomials by foiling to see if you have the correct factored form. So if you're trying to find the binomial factors and you have a difference of two squares, if the polynomial meets these criteria, it's a binomial. there's a minus sign in between the two terms, the first term is a perfect square and the last term is a perfect square, then it will have these characteristics in factored form. The firsts will be equal and the lasts will be opposites. If you're looking for the binomial factors and you have a perfect square trinomial, if the polynomial meets these requirements, it's a trinomial. The first is a perfect square, the last is a perfect square, and the last is positive, then it will have these characteristics in factored form. It will be a binomial multiplied by itself. The sign in the binomial will match the sign of the b term in your original trinomial. If you're looking for the binomial factors and you don't have a difference of two squares and you don't have a perfect square trinomial, then you're going to have to guess and check it by foiling. Here are 3 important tips for you while you're guessing and checking. Look for prime numbers, numbers that only have 2 factors. If A is a prime number or C is a prime number, then no guessing is required. You already know what numbers to use to multiply together to get that A, which is a prime number, or that C, which is a prime number. If you have to guess, start with the factors that are closest together on the number line. So if you have a list of 3 factors that could possibly multiply together to get your A value or your C value, pick the pair of factors that's closest together on the number line. This is a guess, but over the years I found out that this guess can get you going the right direction more quickly than picking factors that are farther apart on the number line. And finally, never create a binomial that has a greatest common factor. You should have already taken out the greatest common factor, so neither of the binomials should have a greatest common factor in it. All right, so if the directions say that you need to solve this quadratic equation, then you need to solve it by using the zero product property. And there are 3 things that can come up when you are using the zero product property. First of all, if there's a variable in the greatest common factor, like the 3x here. Second of all, if there's no coefficient in the binomial. Right now in front of the x, there's an unwritten 1. And so there's no coefficient there other than 1. And finally, sometimes there will be a coefficient. In this case, there's a 4 in front of the x. So the x term has a 4 for its coefficient. So anytime there is a variable in the greatest common factor, then you will have one solution that will be a 0. If you do not have a coefficient in front of your x other than 1, then your solution will be an opposite, the opposite of the number that's in that parentheses. And finally, if you do have a coefficient, then you will need to solve the equation where you take the 2 terms inside the parentheses, set them equal to 0, and solve that equation using algebra.